Good morning. This is Luebke with GENEDGE, and appreciate your joining us for the cybersecurity webinar. This is the final presentation in our series. All of the webinars are available on our website under the cybersecurity banner in the webinar section. So you can have access to all 6 of them and watch them at any point in time. So I'm going to do a brief overview here for just a couple of minutes, and then I'm going to turn it over to our guest speaker, Schoenberg, who is the president of HEMISPHERE Cyber, a cybersecurity advisory firm. So first of all, GENEDGE is part of the department. Hi, folks, dialing in. If you could mute your phones, please, that'd be great. Thanks. So GENEDGE is the manufacturing extension partner for the U.S. Department of Commerce. There's at least one organization in every state in the country, and we are part of the state government for Virginia, and we work across the entire state. I've been doing this for over 20 years, focused on helping manufacturing, industrial, and research and development firms to grow their businesses and become more operationally effective. We've got staff all over the state, including our partners down at Old Dominion and out at the Wytheville Community College based out in Wytheville. So just real briefly, what we do is just a spectrum of activities. We help companies understand how to look at their markets and their capabilities differently and how they might be able to expand their business, cybersecurity being one of those elements, looking at improving the operations of the firm, of their companies, looking at environmental factors, the supply chain, helping companies do market research and find either technical opportunities or help them find partners or new markets for their capabilities, helping them with exporting, and also with taking products and services to market and developing a commercialization plan. So just as a brief overview this morning, I'm not going to take away from Carter's thunder, but I just want to kind of set the table here for what we're talking about. For a information security plan and looking at cybersecurity for your company in general, you have to look at this at a higher level than just simply technology. Technology is obviously a critical component in this in terms of firewalls and prevention and protection kinds of measures that you take to be able to thwart people from getting into your system. And they may not be getting into your system to knock your business down, or steal things from you, unless they're after your intellectual property or things like that. They're also looking at you as a springboard to be able to launch into other organizations, and the small business is the weak link in the chain. So the information security plan is looking at helping you define your security policies, helping you define your standard procedures, and then finally getting you to look at the behavior of the people in your organization. And the number one threat still today is inadequate usage of email. Folks are still opening phishing scams. They're opening websites that are not real websites. They're downloading things onto your machines. They're using their own personal equipment to log on to corporate networks and corporate assets, and as a result, it leaves openings and gaps in your system security, and it allows the bad guys to get in and do things on your system. So when you're thinking about a security plan, it's not just the technical piece. The other thing it's not is shelfware. What you absolutely want to avoid here with an information security plan is something that gets printed out and you say, yeah, we got it, and then once a year you dust it off and you go, yeah, we have a plan. This needs to be more of an ongoing evolution to the protection and the responses to attacks over time. It needs to be constantly monitored and reviewed and applied to your operations. So this really should be the guiding policy for your IT groups in terms of setting up passwords and access to different systems, to training people. And we're not talking about in-depth technical training. We're talking about briefings on proper usage of email, or how to protect your smartphones and make them more secure so that when they're linking onto a corporate network, they're not leaving gaps in your system security. So just generally speaking, when you're thinking about an information security plan, what you're doing is you're trying to improve the protection of all of your information system resources. However, you have to do it keeping this in mind. Your system will be attacked at some point in time. And again, attacking and breaching into your system might not necessarily say that it's going to go down or that they're going to steal something. It may be that they were trying to leapfrog onto somebody else's system. So that's really key in thinking about this, because not only are you thinking about your security, you also have to keep in mind what's going on with your customers and with your suppliers, so that when you're sending transactions electronically and you're doing business together, that you've thought about the breadth of your vulnerability. And the plan really ranges right from prevention, which we all think about, but all the way through your business recovery. When something happens to your system, how are you going to recover from that? How are you going to get your business operations back up and running? It's not just simply restoring your system and putting a backup onto the machine and away you go. It's much more complicated than that today. And then finally, this process of documenting, of actually creating this plan, will help you expose some of your gaps and your vulnerabilities. That is really the key to this exercise, is that you think you're protected, and then when you go through some of the outlines, you go through some of the things that Carter's going to bring up for you, it will help you expose some of the gaps. And then it's really documenting what your structured process is. You should have a structured process already in place. A lot of the planning is simply documenting what it is. And again, it's not documenting for the sake of documenting, but it's the documenting for the sake of looking for the gaps. It's also talking to the various managers across the business to understand what the roles and responsibilities are, and making sure that your policies and procedures are aligned with those people, with what those different managers are trying to accomplish. Because you can lock the system down to DEFCON 1 and nobody can use it, but you'll be secure. So you don't want to do. We're not able to do that either. And then we're going to talk about this more, and I've talked about this in a previous webinar about the DFARS clauses. If you're doing business with the Department of Defense, there is a supplemental DFAR referred to as 7012, which is the last four numbers of that DFAR, and the specifications for that are on the NIST website, Special Publication 800-171. That is an outline for the security controls that you have to have in place if you are going to do business in an ongoing way with the Department of Defense. The key is that an information security plan is going to be required as part of your contracts with DoD, and you are signing the document that says you are or as close to being in compliance with the DFAR 7012 as your information security plan is identifying. So keep that in mind. That's the key part of all this stuff. There are many other industry specifications and rules and regulations, and I'm not going to jump the gun on that. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this over to Carter, and I'm going to let him continue on. So Carter, I've made you into the presenter. I'm going to stop sharing, and you should be able to share your screen now.
Okay, great. Thank you, Roy. First, we just want to do a quick voice check. Is everybody able to hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, wonderful. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just going to share my screen. So what I want to be able to cover today, we're not going to try to do like death by PowerPoint or anything like that, but I'd like to be able to, first I'll be able to thank GENEDGE for letting me be able to participate in this very, very important topic. Now, when we're talking about the elements of cybersecurity, we probably have all heard it's about people, policy, and technology. It's not just about technology. Well, in today's threat landscape, unfortunately, it's even been expanded to now focus on 4 tenets: people, policy, technology, and acquisition. Now, before we get started into the actual formal presentation itself, what I thought would be of interest for the viewers is to be able to see notable data points that just came out, and this was provided by FireEye. And again, I just want to make sure that everybody's able to see my screen. You should be looking at 5 cyber attacks, 5 cyber attackers. Okay, so notable interest here is keeping in mind 65% of them have no data security policy. So this isn't to sit there and say everybody out there is wrong, but there is a huge preponderance of individuals that are actually taking a position of understanding what their lawful responsibility is to meet what's called the standard of care. And also of notable interest, and again, this is corroborated here, by 58% of small and medium-sized enterprise managers do not see cyber attacks as a significant risk. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later on in the presentation. So let's go ahead and get started. Again, my name is Carter Schoenberg. I am the President and CEO of HEMISPHERE Cyber Risk Management. HEMISPHERE was launched in July of 2015, and again, we are very pleased to be able to participate with GENEDGE. Our headquarters is actually located in Manassas, Virginia, and we have a satellite office in the Republic of Panama as well. HEMISPHERE provides cyber risk mitigation services based on years of experience our team has in identifying gaps in the way traditional cybersecurity consulting takes place. As part of this analysis, we leverage a proprietary model for assessing financial impacts to our clients when we identify a material weakness. So what we do is we ultimately specialize in where cyber, legal, and insurance considerations converge. Today, we'll be focusing on the importance of constructing and implementing a quote-unquote cybersecurity plan. At the end of today's webinar, I will be sure to leave a few minutes for any questions or comments. Now, when we talk about a cybersecurity plan, what does this even really mean? Are we talking about a large document that's going to be construed as a book? Maybe a little bit something more streamlined that's going to be focusing and have the look and feel of a report? Much like the term cybersecurity itself, I've heard multiple definitions for a cybersecurity plan. But for the purpose of today's webinar, we're going to define this as the operational capability to effectively respond and recover from a cyber event that's going to cause harm to your business operations. If you turn on the TV, if you listen to a podcast or turn on any web browser, the majority of publicly disclosed breaches are aligned with business verticals that we see here, such as healthcare, retail, things along those lines. And while these verticals are important to be sure, these are not the only verticals that are high-value targets, and we will be discussing this in greater detail on the following slides. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, 99% of all businesses are defined as quote-unquote a small business. Most small business owners firmly believe that they are too small for anyone to even bother with them. right? Well, in actuality, that's dead wrong. A recent report from the technology cybersecurity sector supports that greater than 40% of all attacks directly focus on small business. It's also notable that 60% of small businesses close their doors after a cyber event because of the financial implications associated with response, recovery, breach notifications, credit monitoring, and other applicable financial implications. Another notable data point is that the majority of cyber incidents are associated with insider activities. Now, let's give this some context. I'm not saying that the majority of you watching this webinar have an employee or a leader waiting to launch some kind of nefarious attack for personal gain. In actuality, it's quite the opposite. While it is true that the majority of cyber incidents stemming from insider activity result in system disruption, destruction, or unauthorized disclosure of sensitive data, the vast percentage of these scenarios are actually unintentional. At the end of the day, though, if you sustain a cyber incident, the harm is done. As a business owner, should you care that it was unintentional? No, you should not. The ramifications for cleanup and recovery are just as important. It is also important to note that cybersecurity spending is at an all-time high and is going to continue to rise to do so. But if our risk posture is not improving proportional to our spend, we must reevaluate how we assess risk. Taking the approach that Roy made a reference to earlier where, you know what, I've got antivirus, I got a firewall, I'm good. This has proven to be a false perspective on understanding cyber risk. It merely looks at cyber as only an IT issue. Having been involved on these matters now for over 16 years, this is far from being factually accurate. Some of you may be familiar with insurance topics like general liability or even errors and omissions. But what about cyber? What is interesting to note is the fact that the majority of insurance claims filed for damages associated with a cyber event stem from small business. Furthermore, when that claim is actually filed, between 75 to 80% of the policy value is exhausted during incident response and recovery. This leaves very little value of the policy left to be able to contend with other topics that are usually associated with a cyber breach, such as potential legal considerations. Now, when I'm talking about legal considerations, I'm not specifically referencing a person or a group of people suing you, but 48 states, with the exception of Alabama and South Dakota, have data breach notification laws, and failure to comply could trigger the state attorney general to further investigate your business. Other considerations may include the Federal Trade Commission, Security and Exchange Commission if you're publicly traded, Health and Human Services Office of Civil Rights if you maintain, store, or transmit electronic health care records, and coming soon to a theater near you, State Insurance Commission reporting requirements. So if you are in the insurance sector as an agent, broker, or carrier, there will be very soon a law that will be across all 50 states, including the Virgin Islands, the U.S. Virgin Islands, that will have mandatory reporting requirements to also not only notify the state attorney general, but the state insurance commissioner as well. Regardless of what type of legal action may ensue, your ability to demonstrate how well you were capable of responding and recovering is critical. But before any of this can even really be acted upon, you first have to know, where do you even begin? There are two schools of thought on where to start. One, create policies to then measure the effectiveness through a risk assessment, or conduct a risk assessment and apply that knowledge to your cyber planning activities. For today's webinar, there statistically is a high probability that most of you do not even have a cyber plan in place. Based on our experiences, we firmly believe a risk assessment is mission critical to your business operations. The rationale is there is a high probability you will miss something in your documentation design, and then you will have to undergo very timely activities to rewrite it after you do the risk assessment post-mortem. So if we start with a risk assessment, what are prudent next steps going to look like? Two key areas to focus on. The first is going to be the inventorying of your computer assets. Now, before you say, Carter, I know and I've got a pretty good idea what's on my network, what I'm going to ask each of you to consider is the following. First off, do you allow bring your own devices? Do you use cloud, including Box or even Google Drives? Wireless printers? Do you allow business partners to interconnect with your network? Or something as simple as, do you utilize a service provider's resources, like a Regis facility? There is a reason the term, quote-unquote, shadow IT exists, and that's because what we think we have versus what we may actually have could differ. Are these assets even properly documented, whether it's on a spreadsheet or a Word document? At the end of the day, trying to protect your network without knowing everything that's on it is going to be problematic. Once an organization has successfully mapped out its network topology, regardless of how small, the next step is to identify what types of data you possess. So let's look at it in terms of general day-to-day business operations. What do you have internally? Personnel data, things that could be associated with 401k, Social Security numbers from your I-9. So it would also include addresses, dates of birth, telephone numbers, and personal emails. While this was kind of few and far between, more and more companies, because of the increased cost of healthcare coverages, are launching health challenges to demonstrate to the carriers that their employees should enjoy discounts because they're leading healthier lifestyles. If you are an organization that has these kinds of health challenges and you provide Fitbits or other type of wearable technologies, please note there are a variety of states that actually now say you must provide additional safeguards for the data that is generated in these activities. If you have a client or a business partner, what type of financial information do you possess? What about electronic health care records? What about their proprietary data? Mailing lists even, or personally identifiable information that can be yielded from other mechanisms. Now, most of you are probably aware of the basics and regulatory requirements today, such as the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, if you're dealing with healthcare records, or the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. Most of you could be dealing with credit card transactions. But what about state data breach notification laws? Please keep in mind, as I said earlier, there are 48 states that have their own unique data breach reporting requirements. In point of fact, how each of them even defines what is the minimum trigger differs, and in some instances, how you actually respond to those that were impacted could be limited, such as there is the state up in the Northeast where once you notify their Attorney General, you are required by state law not to advise the impacted victim how the breach took place, only that a breach took place. As Roy mentioned earlier, the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulations and how it now applies to what they're defining controlled but unclassified information in non-federal systems and organizations. Let me repeat that, in non-federal systems and organizations. So it's no longer enough to sit there and think, I have a piece of technology that I'm selling to the U.S. government, and I know it must undergo rigorous stress testing and software assurance evaluations before the government will purchase it and allow it in its infrastructure. It has now moved to not only that, but also what is your corporation doing in terms of safeguarding sensitive data, being able to adequately demonstrate that your organization has proper cyber hygiene. And if you can bear with me for 1 second, I wanted to share this with everybody. This kind of piggybacks on what Roy was saying, but very recently, keeping in mind, the government now reserves the right to actually look at your system security plans as defined by the DFAR requirements and as instructions include in NIST 800-171 as well as plans of actions to evaluate the overall risk introduced by the state or the contractor's internal information systems and networks. Federal Trade Commission. Most of us might take into consideration that the Federal Trade Commission is only going to go after large organizations. And while this is generally true, there have been an increasing number of cases where the FTC is targeting small business owners because of what they're advising on their corporate websites, how they maintain or protect consumer information. Earlier this year, the state of New York's Department of Financial Services issued a cyber law that not only mandates if certain criteria are in place that you perform vulnerability assessments and penetration testing, but that you must also, as a matter of law, have somebody acting in the capacity of a Chief Information Security Officer and becoming directly applicable for U.S. markets in May 25th of next year is a European standard called the General Data Protection Regulation. Now, granted, most of us as American business owners may think to ourselves, that's not going to apply to us. However, please note, this directly impacts 28 countries, and the U.S. has reciprocal agreements with the UK stakeholders that created this law, which again comes back to being able to adequately demonstrate when a breach occurs, what were you positioned to do from people, policy, technology, and acquisition.
And Carter, this is Roy. I'm going to jump in and just make one statement on the DFARS for folks that are listening in. That is in place for both prime and subcontractors. So if you're a sub on a DoD contract to a prime, both companies, all the companies on that contract are covered under that DFARS 7012 reg. So you need to make sure that if you're a sub, don't ignore this because it's on you as well. Or if you are a prime and you've got subs, you have responsibility to ensure that your subs have a information security plan as well.
That's a great point, Roy. And one of the things that HEMISPHERE has been engaged with some companies is actually reviewing even teaming agreements, even making sure at that stage that all parties understand what the level of expectations are going to be able to compete. Because once the award is granted, if the approach is, well, we'll do it once we get the award, you can take that approach, but you might be limited from actually being able to accrue any revenue until you're able to effectively demonstrate that your system security plan is meeting the level of risk tolerance of the U.S. government at that time. So that's a great point, Roy. Also, unfortunately, if you have any experience in reviewing solicitations, the U.S. government will generally call out your attention in a form of a table, items of particular interest to them. Whether it is requirements for types of insurance or financial considerations or that you have not filed for bankruptcy or things like that. You would think, given the nature and the criticality of these requirements, that more of the onus would be put onto the government to highlight this. Unfortunately, we've seen on a number of occasions where it is simply one sentence included in a paragraph that kind of obfuscates it. Now, I'm not saying that we're of the opinion that we think that the government is doing this intentionally. What we actually feel is that the majority of the government's acquisition workforce has not necessarily matured to that level of being able to communicate what their expectations are in this capacity. When we made reference to control but unclassified information, NARA, the National Archives and Records Administration, has a clearly defined list of everything that they are construing as controlled unclassified information. If you do not have access to that link, if you'd like to contact me after this webinar, and my contact information will be made available, more than happy to be able to share that with you. the government has socialized in certain industry days that they would clearly denote what elements of that list would be applicable for these additional safeguards. But there is also a belief in the market space today that, from what we've seen, other than denoting CUI will apply, yes, no, it would not become any more granular than that, leaving it up to the government contractor to better determine what do I need to protect and why. So now that you've reasonably identified what your network looks like, what type of data you have, and what you are going to be legally required to abide by, and even if resources permit, perhaps you've even been successful in running a vulnerability scan. Let's say all of these are completed. It is equally, if not more important, to understand who may desire to cause you harm. Given the fact that we are in 2017, it never ceases to amaze me how many business owners of all sizes still actually think that their primary adversary is some teenager in the basement. Now, while they do exist and are sometimes successful, the fact of the matter is that today's threat landscape is far more complex. Nation-state and organized criminal syndicates are the primary driving force in the vast majority of breaches that we see publicly disclosed. So, why is this important for a cyber plan? Because understanding what data you possess directly links to the type of adversary that will target you and what types of tools, tactics, and protocols they will leverage. Why would China be interested in a 10-person company in Des Moines, Iowa? Well, does the company make niche components for the F-22 Joint Strike Fighter? If so, that's kind of self-evident. Supply chain cyber risk is front and center in today's threat landscape, especially for government contractors, financial, or healthcare institutions. Why would a Russian organized syndicate target a healthcare system with ransomware? Because their training and expertise dictates that certain businesses, like healthcare, have a mission criticality to keep operations sustainable, and, if necessary, they will pay a ransom. I made reference this earlier to the types of business verticals. What about law firms, though? Can stakeholders financially gain from seeing what future M&A or IPOs are going to be imminent? You bet. And obviously these would be of great value for anyone that would want to financially gain, either as an individual actor, supporting a nation state, or organized criminal syndicates. So, now the elephant in the room. Should I do this on my own or outsource these activities? Absent of some strict statutory requirements, you can actually do these activities in-house, but I don't think that that's the right question. What you should be asking yourself is, if I do this on my own, what will I miss? Lest we forget, do you even have the time to do these activities with any degree of proficiency? So again, let's just do a quick recap. We've inventoried our assets and data. We've learned about how different adversaries will target differently depending on their desired goals: financial gain, intelligence gathering, etc. Now that these activities are complete, you will take this newfound knowledge to complete the following: create a corporate security policy and make sure employees commit to them. How would you demonstrate that they're able to commit to them? Applying lessons learned, usually what HEMISPHERE has seen in the past is, rather than trying to do a one-by-one at different times of the year, most organizations have employee reviews at a specific time of the year. We've seen great success in being able to leverage that particular point in time where the manager or the employer is working with the employee to go over their performance, to make sure that they understand and actually formally sign off on rules of behavior, corporate security policies, and demonstrating not only the committing to them, but in the worst case scenario, providing additional levels of protection to the corporation, saying, we did everything we could, this was an individual error. From here, create an incident response plan. Now these next three bullets might seem a little out of place. Training your employees, encrypting the records, and perform frequent backups. So why, Carter, would this be important for a cyber plan? Well, because if you're not able to train your employees in these areas, their ability to be effective and efficient is slim to none. Also, if the bad guys are able to get into your network, understanding what policies you have and what playbook you would leverage in response to a crisis is going to be of value to them. And with regards to providing frequent backups and keeping a copy, if your system was unfortunately taken offline because of ransomware or some other type of attack, and your only way to be able to access those policies in an incident response plan is through your computer, there's nothing really you can do at that point. Now, first off, many of you may support the U.S. government as a defense contractor. Now, again, one of the things that Roy brought up was talking about a system security plan that I highlighted before. Now, how does this actually differ from a cyber plan? The reality is it's going to be about context and visualization. So SSPs are designed to show specific security controls and how the system owner is meeting, partially meeting, or not meeting said controls. Comparatively, a cyber plan is more of an operations document to describe your corporate governance of cyber risk objectives. And creating either an SSP or a corporate cyber plan is not for the faint of heart. Many business owners take the position of this guy right here. Okay, I don't have time for this stuff. This isn't going to be important for me. Let me focus on doing what I have to be able to do. And there are also lots of free templates that are out there. If you go to the Department of Homeland Security or the Federal Trade Commission's website, or you can even do a search on FTC Cyber Small Business. There's a lot of available resources out there. And I'm not going to say that these are problems, but these are certainly issues that you as business owners need to take into consideration. First, there is a presumption that you will know how to complete. And second, these can be very resource intensive. And now when I say resource intensive, you could be looking at better than 30 calendar days in trying to be able to complete these as a draft and being able to assess their effectiveness. I don't know about many of you, but from what we've seen, many small, medium-sized businesses struggle with being able to make this level of commitment. Heck, even large companies struggle in being able to make this kind of commitment. But it doesn't change the fact that because of the current threat landscape and statutory and regulatory considerations, these have now become the new norm for assessing, are you meeting a minimum standard of care? Now, to clarify in terms, a cyber plan is a plan that includes pre- and post-event activities. Okay, pre-event would be policies, and post-event would be an incident response or a disaster recovery plan. The thing to keep in mind, though, is that when you're looking at an incident response plan or a disaster recovery plan, you may look at that in terms of, well, these are technically different. And while technically correct, most businesses can reduce their paperwork by having an all-inclusive disaster recovery plan that includes the aspects and roles into the overarching cyber plan. It is critical to understand that you cannot limit yourself to just yourself. You likely have more touch points than you would take into consideration. And what I'm going to ask you to do is, if you please take a look at these fairly recent breaches, you will notice that all of these are coming back to third parties. There is also most recently identified another breach that's tied to the U.S. government as a result of one of the big four consulting firms who shall remain nameless. But again, this is an example of the risk landscape with having third-party businesses interconnecting with your infrastructure or being able to have access to your data assets itself. Now, this excerpt right here has been taken from one of our work products, and please notice the narrative described in red. In the event you sustain a cyber incident and you are obliged to disclose either by regulatory or statutory requirements, these documents are likely going to be some of the first things that the regulators are going to be looking at. And again, last year, 63% of all these breaches were attributed to a third party. As business owners, you cannot simply look at this as just an IT issue. At the end of the day, you want to make sure that your operations are sustainable and you're limiting your exposure to having to pay out dollars either in breach remediation services or responding to legal claims. Your corporate security policies and your incident response plans are likely going to be the first two items that regulators and plaintiffs will in fact be looking for. Things to keep in mind, what you should do and what you should make sure that you're not doing. Make it easily accessible, make it actionable, and make it repeatable. Now, what not to do. Obviously, this was meant to have a degree of humor, but I would be lying to you if I said in the course of my career I have not seen scenarios where I've come onto a client's site and asked to see their formal policies and incident response plan, and they literally pull a 3-ring binder that has dust on it that has not been looked at in a number of years. Not to mention the fact, in those instances where they don't have dust on it, the latest revision was several years old. Now, as I'm sure that you can imagine, to have formal documentation on how you deal with a crisis event that's several years old, this all comes back to what type of technology do you have in your portfolio. Unless you're keeping your technologies for more than 10 years, making sure that you're able to apply lessons learned and making it more effective and consistent with your current topology, such as maybe at one point you were operating server 2012, but now you're operating 2016. How are the feature sets of those two different, and how does that have a direct impact one way or the other, if at all, on your organization? I'm not suggesting that you need to revise this in its entirety, but as business owners, it is certainly critical for you to understand where you may have deficits that require revisions in these documents. Now that you have these cyber plans in place, what should you do? Assess the plan's functionality. Compare the policy to operations. If you've ever heard of a tabletop exercise, this is where you come in and you simulate a crisis event. Document who attended. Did the plan operate as it was originally designed? Was there a gap identified between the incident response plan and the authorities of what was within the corporate policies and procedures in the first place? If so, please make sure that you update your documentation to apply these lessons learned. Most type of templates that are out there, in addition, right after your table of contents, you should have like a version page. This is where you want to make sure that you update it by showing the date, who was responsible for the change, and what changes took place in that particular document itself. Test both escalation paths. You should have an internal and an external calling tree. Now, again, this is done in a very, very generic capacity to be vertical agnostic, but I think you're getting the general point here. What I would advise for you to take note of when I make references to having a cybersecurity insurance policy, the external contract calling tree is very, very important. Many insurance companies, as part of their policy definitions itself, you are actually required to notify them before you take any remediative actions. Now, I don't mean that you found a vulnerability and you need to patch it, but if it looks like that there was a successful data breach that took place, you are actually responsible to notify your insurance carrier so that way they can have the companies that are on their panels from a legal perspective, incident response perspective, marketing and outreach campaigns, breach notifications, credit monitoring. In failure to do so, if you decided, you know what, I've got my own attorney, I'm going to go that route, buyer beware. If you take that route, in some cases, depending on how the policy is written, the insurance carrier is not obliged to have to pay out. So I see that we have about 13 minutes left. I know that we've covered a lot of content, and I would like to, as a promise, be able to leave this open now for structured Q&A session. My contact information is up here. If you would like more information on HEMISPHERE's Cyber Plan program, please feel free to contact me. Please make sure that you put in the subject GENEDGE so I can basically attribute where these requests are coming from as a result of this webinar. Our training materials include video tutorials that actually walk you through how to address these types of cyber plans, as well as being able to provide pre-event and post-event cyber risk services. So at this time, I will leave it open for any comments and questions that the attendees may have.
Sure. Thanks, Carter. Appreciate all the insight. And again, this is a complex issue. It takes, like Carter said, it's time-consuming. Sometimes people think it's it's just a waste of resource, and that's why I said at the beginning, a lot of the exercise can be very helpful to finding and uncovering gaps. Right? You think that you know something, or you think that what you're doing is effective, and then when you start comparing it to some specifications or some industry drivers or whatever, now all of a sudden you see that that you're missing some stuff. One question that I was going to give to you, Carter, is one comment you made was about encrypting data. And without getting technical, how complex an effort is that for a company, especially a small company? Maybe the technology people that they have there, their skills are, they're good, but they're not outstanding, or, they're not, I shouldn't say outstanding, but, what I'm saying, they're not as broad as they could be. How complex is that for your small business?
Sure. Well, let's talk about two things. So when we're talking about encryption, you have two core elements: data at rest and data in transit. Now, to actually encrypt data at rest, there are all kinds of full disk encryption technologies that are out there. We're vendor agnostic, so whether it is Semantic, Checkpoint, BitLocker from Microsoft, there are a variety of solutions that are out there. They're actually fairly easy to apply, but the problem, Roy, that comes in is if you come in with a clean disk and you launch the software to do the full disk encryption versus you already have a server or a laptop or a desktop that's been used for, let's say, a number of years, the amount of time it will take to encrypt every 1 and 0 that's in the registry of servers, the disk space for servers, laptops, or desktops, it's going to be probably a force factor of between 7 to 10 times the level of time that would be necessary. So with regards to being able to say how hard is it to implement, it's not too dissimilar from point and click of launching new applications and software, but to take into consideration the level of time that that asset is now going to be unavailable until it has gone through its full disk encryption. For data in transit, there are a variety of different providers that are out there. So if you're leveraging Microsoft Office 365, they have an encryption mechanism. There's also a service provider called Virtru, which is good for Outlook, as well as if you're using Gmail. From our perspective, the ability to be able to implement that is going to be critical because, as you made reference to, accessing of sensitive data via emails is still one of the more common vulnerability points. And I'm not suggesting that transmitting in an encrypted format is going to prevent a phishing attack. However, what it will do is it gives you the options with a very, very friendly user interface on making it a determination. Do I want this to be sent over the internet in an unencrypted fashion? Do I have anything in this email that I should deem sensitive, such as maybe ITAR requirements, these new CUI definitions, financial data? There's a whole litany of things that, as business owners, that you may not normally construe as requiring additional safeguards, but that you should. There was actually, Roy, a very interesting case in the state of Virginia. It was a civil case, and basically you had an individual that left a company, and that company decided they want to seek civil litigation against the individual that left for potentially infringing upon non-compete agreements. The employee that left knew who the lawyers were for the company and what their operational processes were. This particular law firm that represented this company had a boxed account, and all those communications between the plaintiff and the attorney were kept in this box enclave. But because they were not properly protected, no additional safeguards were provided, it allowed the defendant to access it. When it went to court, basically they were saying, no, you can't use any of that because that's attorney-client privilege. Oddly enough, the court found if it was that sensitive, you would have done a better job protecting it. And therefore, we're not going to allow that to be construed as attorney-client privilege. So the dynamics of the marketplace and the legal landscape on what courts are now going to define as sensitive is ratcheting up significantly, much more so in the past couple of years than we've seen since probably the past decade.
Great, thanks. Appreciate that. One other question is related to cybersecurity insurance. How important, or what's your view on the importance of a information security plan, a cybersecurity plan, as it relates to obtaining a cyber insurance policy with a company?
So one of the things that we can advise is at the onset we may reference the fact that HEMISPHERE focuses on that convergence between cyber, legal, and insurance considerations. We actually did a blind test of 3 insurance carriers where we provided no documentation versus providing documentation that we inherently believe organizations need to have, such as an access control plan, media protection plan, and incident response plan. The savings were significant for those scenarios where we actually could denote, yes, we have these documents. Now, what we have heard from carriers and brokers is that, well, we don't necessarily give you a discount on having that documentation, but in these blind tests, the data did in fact support that you would have a significant savings. Now, what does these significant savings really mean for a small or medium-sized business owner? You can realistically obtain $1 million of coverage for maybe a couple of grand. But in these particular situations, what we were able to see, Roy, is without the documentation, the average was about $2,600, and with the documentation, $1,700. So, granted, $900 may not be breaking the bank one way or the other, but from a percentage of ownership, $900 is pretty significant on that total investment.
Yeah, and as I talk to people about the cyber insurance part of it, it's not so much, what I've seen is it's not so much a matter of the policy as much as it is a matter of the payout. So the company, the insurance company is in the business not paying, right? That's how they make money. So, they're going to put caveats and clauses in their policy verbiage that says, they're going to cover this, they're not going to cover that, and it's up to you to have documentation that shows that you got your P's and Q's lined up. So to me, I think that's where, where the real value is in linking these two together, is to say, when something does happen and you need to go to your insurance for some recovery, that, you're not going to get into a big major fight with these guys over it.
Right. Well, you're bringing up an excellent point, Roy, because the particular markets for the insurance for cyber are increasing at an alarming rate. So in 2015, the market cap was about $1 billion. Last year was about $2.5 billion. This year it's tracking for over $3 billion, and estimates are that the market will be about $7.5 billion by 2020. So there is a lot of initiatives out there to write the paper, but how well are they effectively evaluating the cyber risk profile of the company? I've seen policies written for $1 million where only 10 questions are being asked. Now, to your point, what are the exclusions that are in that policy? There was actually a great example that took place within the past year with a restaurant chain called P.F. Chang's. P.F. Chang's unfortunately sustained a data breach exposing millions of credit cards. And the insurance paid out to P.F. Chang's minus their deductible on the cost for crisis management, incident response, legal considerations, things along those lines. And everybody was happy as a clam, and they thought that the damage was done and business went on as usual. Until the credit card companies came back and said, here's a bill for $1.2 million. Here's what it costs us to reissue all of these credit cards. That was not covered in the policy. So simply saying that you're going to have a policy, make sure that you have an individual that is qualified to understand what is actually going to be covered and what is not going to be covered. Because at the end of the day, if you have a policy and you're operating, well, you know, I'm good, maybe you are, but maybe you're not. And again, we're also starting to see, Roy, some companies take the position of, well, if I have cyber insurance, why do I even need to do any of this stuff? Well, one, because there's a regulatory or statutory requirement for you to do so. And two, there are exclusions in there where if you have a duty to respond and to meet the minimum standard of care and you're not doing so, you're giving the insurance carriers the get out of jail free card to justify in not paying that claim.
Sure. Well, thanks, Carter. I appreciate the time. We're running out of time on our time here today. So I'm just going to give our audience a couple of final notes here. You can go to our website and download a self-assessment for your business that will help you start to uncover some of these policy, procedure, and controls that you're going to need to include in an information security, cyber security plan. So there's no charge for that, and feel free, go ahead and download that for your business. So in conclusion, what I want to tell you all is that we've spent the last couple of years finding some specialist firms in Virginia, companies like Carter's, that have some unique positions and some unique expertise. So depending on what kind of where your business is, and because of the fact that we are a state agent as well as being involved with the U.S. Department of Commerce, we're able to package this in a way to make it much more affordable. And so GENEDGE can come in and work with you to help identify what assets you're trying to protect and get you started on this process, and then bring in some outside folks to do vulnerability assessments or gap analysis, depending on, both from a technical standpoint as well as a policy and procedure standpoint. Out of that effort, you end up then with a gap analysis that says, in a prioritized way, meaning what's the most impactful and highest probability event that could happen to your business, and what do you need to do to start to build a fence around those gaps and not try to eat the elephant all at one time. So there's lots of different things that you're going to have to do over time, but you don't have to look at this and go, we have to spend the money all up front to be completely, secure and DEFCON 1 here. What we're saying is that there's a prioritized approach to this to start to whittle down your vulnerabilities and increase your cyber risk posture. So that brings our webinar to a conclusion today. I appreciate all of your attendance. I will make this presentation available. I think we email it out to all of the attendees. We put it up on our website probably by the close of the day, and we'll have the slides available for you to download as well. So at that, we are concluding the webinar, and have a good day. Thank you. Goodbye.